But yeah, it's great to be back, and thank you guys again to Laura and Catherine, who's away today, but for putting this together and kind of, investing so much time in getting people and women especially interested in gravel, and um, going through the basics and focusing a lot on the mechanical stuff. I think it's really so important. Um, I know last week we talked a lot about how to prep your bike for going for a ride. We went through sort of some of my, must-haves heading out the door for a gravel ride or a regular ride. And I think we talked a little bit through, you know, on the ride tools, what to carry in a seat bag. And those are the lists that, Laura and I kind of put together for everyone. And I think, I'd like to sort of lean into, there's four total lists that we posted. So the first two are kind of, the basic tools to ride with, the sort of DIY gravel set to ride with, and then the tools to keep at home, and some advanced tools to keep at home. And I think that the last two are what I was thinking that it would help for us to lean into a little bit more today. So that kind of goes along with, how do you tell the difference between a home repair and a shop repair? There's a lot of stuff that that can be handled at home, and then there's, I think for women especially, a lot of it comes down to confidence of knowing, okay, I can do this at home, versus knowing when it's time to say, you know what, I'm tapping out, I'm going to take my bike to a shop, or to a friend who may be a little bit more confident in this stuff than I am. And I think that my biggest piece of advice in kind of doing some of that, where my dad would go, oh, we delegate, in saying like, okay, we'll bring it to the shop for this, right? Maybe you bring the shop mechanic a 6-pack of beer and say, hey, can I watch you do this so that I can learn for next time? I think that is, it's hard, at least for me personally, to ask for help like that, to be like, hey, can I watch you do this so that I can learn for next time? It's almost that idea of when we're working with the juniors, sort of either locally, I work a lot with the Connecticut juniors or the national junior team, we'll say show one, teach one, do one. So we'll show them how to do something, and then we'll, have them hands-on, and we're talking them through it, and then we'll have them do it, and we'll just sit there and watch. And I think that for a lot of the mechanical stuff is a great way to learn. And I think most mechanics are super open to teaching for some of the, some of these things. So with that in mind, home versus shop repairs, I would say definitely, this is going to depend on the kind of equipment that you're riding, but something like cables, if you have to change out a cable, if you need to charge a battery, if you're riding an electronic system, something like that, definitely you can handle at home. And to most people's comfort levels, I think minor derailleur adjustments can be handled at home. So that's just like, hey, it's skipping a little bit in the big ring, or it's skipping a little bit in the little ring, where you're just tweaking that barrel adjuster a little bit to kind of to kind of get that hop out of the chain, that can definitely be done at home. If it's something like setting up a derailleur from scratch, that's a comfort level thing where you may want to bring it to a shop. The other thing that you can absolutely do at home, and we did kind of talk about this a lot last week, I think, was replacing a chain. And, you know, I think that this is kind of a point, you know, I tried to make in some of those lists that we've published, but I'll sort of reiterate it again, is that chain length is really drivetrain specific. So it depends on, you know, your bike, right? So you may have a different long cage versus short cage derailleur. That'll affect chain length. You might be running a larger cassette than someone else, and that will affect chain length. And the other thing that will affect it too is what type of components you're riding. For example, like a 12-speed axis chain from SRAM, chain length is going to be measured a little bit differently than, you know, like a standard Force 22 chain from SRAM. So that sort of tweaking it, you know, and guessing the big to big plus 2 links that I usually use doesn't always translate perfectly between those two systems. So the absolute best measurement is to use your existing chain. But in a pinch, you know, you can guess it. So that's definitely something that can be done at home. Things that I would say absolutely unequivocally need to be done at a shop. Anything that's creaking or cracking. So say you're putting torque on your pedals, you know, going to climb a hill or something, and you just hear this nasty creak coming out of that bottom bracket area. That's one of those I would absolutely take it to a shop, because that's something that could, you know, blow up very quickly. And it's one of those, you know, if you take it to a shop, the work is guaranteed. They're going to know exactly, you know, which parts need to be worked on, whether they need to be replaced, whether they need to be, you know, cleaned and repacked. So something like the bottom bracket is I would definitely take to a shop, because if you try to work on that at home, you know, you could end up damaging the frame, which would cost a lot more money than taking it to a shop in the first place. And the same thing goes for the headset too. So the headset which we sort of, I think, showed it last week, you know, it's that piece that connects the steer tube of the fork onto the frame. And, you know, that, just like the bottom bracket, is packed with bearings and special lubricants, and, you know, is very torque sensitive. It's one of the things I always check before I go out the door, but that's definitely something, you know, if you notice like it's grinding or creaking or clicking when you go to move the handlebars, I would have a shop look at that, again, because there's those bearings involved, before I would try to take it apart at home. And that's just, you know, having seen both sides of the spectrum. You know, somebody brings something in and goes, it's creaking, I've isolated it to this spot. You know, just diagnosing a problem at home is 99% of the battle, because you can go into the shop and you can say, I know exactly what's wrong. You know, I might not know why it's creaking, but I know that it's this area and it's creaking. Please help. You know, and it's a little bit peace of mind too, because all of that work is going to be guaranteed. And most of the time they're going to be able to, you know, source OEM parts, rather than trying to rebuild what you have. Those I would definitely take to a shop. The other thing would be any like carbon that seems to be fatigued or cracking. You know, and this is, if you're riding a carbon frame on gravel, chances are you've nicked the frame on a rock or a stump or something. You know, if it just skims the clear coat, you're good to go. It's probably not an issue. If you start to see a crack developing, you might want to think about taking it into a shop just to be like, hey, and most of the time you won't have to leave the bike. It could just be like a peace of mind thing. Hey, can you guys take a look at this, crack and let me know what you think, sort of severity wise. And, a lot of shops right off the bat will mark a crack in carbon with a Sharpie and say, hey, you might want to keep an eye on this. If it gets worse, come back, we'll send the frame out for repair. Or if it's something pretty severe, they'll say, hey, you might want to, not ride this frame. You might want to either look into a new frame, get a loaner frame from the shop. There's options that they can kind of talk you through in that case. And it's one of those, especially, a friend said to me this week that bikes are quickly becoming the new toilet paper, where you can't find them anywhere. So a lot of people have been asking me about used bikes, and that's the carbon frame is something that I would absolutely check with a used bike. Even if it's a bike that you got new 3 years ago and you're using it yourself, it's still going through some wear and tear. So I would definitely check that for sure. Things that, I think Laura and I were talking about this a little bit before the webinar today, is certain things, kind of fall into this category where I would say you could do it at home, but it really depends on your comfort level. And I think the example Laura and I used was setting up a tubeless tire system. So that's one of those where if it's the first time you've ever tried something like this, I would bring it to a shop. If the shop has set it up and on one bike and you've just got another bike that you want to set it up for, you could try to tackle that at home if you're feeling ambitious, but it does get pretty messy in that example. Other things in that category, I would say, is setting up a new derailleur, whether it's a mechanical cable system or it's an electronic system. Setting a derailleur up from scratch is, one of those, once you get the hang of it, it's not too bad, but that's one of those you may want to bring it to a shop the first time or two and have them let you watch as they do it, sort of thing. And another thing I would put in that category is to bleed, either set up or bleed hydraulic disc brakes. Again, that's one of those, once you've done it a few times, it's not so bad, but it does make a mess. So certain things are you could say, I could do this at home, but I don't feel like making a mess. That's totally fair if you want to sort of tap out on that and bring it to a shop. But a lot of this is also going to depend on your equipment, which is sort of the other piece that I was hoping that we could talk about today, is sort of how to choose your equipment. And what works for me for equipment definitely isn't guaranteed to be the thing that's going to work for everybody else for equipment. So it's very personalized. And I guess that this is probably a good time, before we dive right into that, to make sure, I don't see questions in the chat, but if anybody has questions on sort of that home versus shop repair, just stop me and ask. Go for it.
Just type the question. I was curious at what the protocol is for brake bleeds. Like, I've mostly just had them done when I issue, but are you supposed to do them on a certain routine, or?
I mean, I've heard mixed feedback on that. I tend to go by feel. So if the brakes are feeling, and it's so hard to explain, but it's like they almost feel spongy.
Yep.
That's when I would say, all right, I need to bleed these brakes. And if you're starting to notice that you're having to apply more pressure or it's taking longer to get to a full stop on brake bleeds or on disc brakes, I would check the pads first because tend to um, those tend to wear out before sort of a sealed hydraulic system would. So that would be my first check, would be the pads. And if the pads look fine, then that's definitely where you might want to say, okay, maybe we lost some fluid in the system somehow, which shouldn't really happen, but it does wear out over time. And then, in that case, I always go by feel, it seems like. And it depends on how much you're riding too.
Got a couple questions on that.
Yeah.
What about flying? Does that affect whether
Oh
to?
boy. um, Flying shouldn't really affect it. Again, you're talking about a sealed system, and it's DOT fluid, so it it should be okay. There's not enough of a pressure difference flying. If you were gonna fly your bike to the moon or something, then we might have a different answer for that. um, you know, 1/6 gravity and all that, but for the most part, you should be safe to fly with it. I would just be very, very careful when you're packing your bike to fly that you're not disturbing those hydro lines at all. Um, and changing the fluid each season, that's not a bad sort of benchmark, but again, it depends on how much you're riding. I've seen people go years in between bleeding brakes, and I've also been at a cross race where we're bleeding brakes every couple of laps. um, because the conditions were that bad. um, uh, Disc brake pads. um, Disc brake pads, typically they'll have a composite material for actually stopping. Some of them I think have metal, but generally I haven't found that it's materials to be more durable. I think I've definitely found that it's OEM versus third-party pads, much like the derailleur hanger discussion we had last week, that I've always found OEM disc brake pads to be the most effective with whatever system you're running. I don't know the specifics on patent laws with that stuff, but I imagine that they have their specific materials patented, and the third parties are using a slight tweak in that sense. But I don't know that it's one material is sort of a gold standard over another. I would sort of work with your local shop and see what works, what doesn't. If you're going through the same kind of pad over and over again like crazy, it's a lot like running shoes. Change it up, try a different one. Maybe you'll get a little more longevity out of that, for sure. So, and those are definitely considerations when you're choosing your equipment, right? You're looking at, okay, do I want disc brakes? Do I want cantilever brakes? I think the majority of gravel bikes these days are disc brakes. So, my cross bike is still a canny, but that's, it's a hand-me-down team bike that I don't know that I could bring myself to get rid of if I tried. So if you're looking at getting a new bike though, right, how do you decide? So say you want disc brakes and you want disc brakes. Some some models I think still use mechanical disc brakes, which have a cable. It works much the same as a cantilever brake. It's just you're applying the force to stop with a cable as opposed to hydraulic pressure. I would say my preference personally is for the hydraulic system, on the idea that it's a sealed system. If you're riding in crappy conditions, so you've got crazy thick mud or river crossings or just lots of dirt and dust getting caked into your drivetrain, knowing that you're going to be able to stop no matter the conditions because you have this sealed system, that to me is well worth the investment in the hydraulic disc brakes. They do tend to be a little more expensive. If you're building a bike from scratch, I would definitely have a shop set up the hydraulic system from scratch for you. It's a little easier with a lot of these things to maintain them yourself than it is to set them up. So the other point, I guess, is that I've heard new bikes are very hard to come by these days. Is if you're getting, say, a used bike, you want to know how to evaluate it, right? The number of friends I've had in the last few weeks who've come to me and been like, hey, I was looking for a bike. I saw this on Craigslist. Like, could you take a look at it? Or could you come with me to look at this bike? And that's one of those things. I'll check the brakes, I'll check the headset, I'll check the bottom bracket, anything carbon I will look at with, like, I don't bring a microscope with me to look at it, but you get the idea of a microscope, just to make sure that what these people are signing up for, they know up front, because you could think you're getting a great deal on a bike used, but it ends up being a headache and a small fortune to fix it. I had a friend a year or so ago get like a new mountain bike frame or something, and it shows up like the frame shows up and it's got these nasty cracks in it, and he's like, those weren't in the pictures. It's like, oh, you didn't ask for complete pictures. That's you've got to be careful with some of that stuff. The other option I would say that's out there, if you're looking for a new bike but maybe don't want to drop a small fortune on it, don't want to deal with the legwork of finding a used bike that meets your needs, is a lot of times there are old team bikes, from either gravel pros are getting new bikes in for the next season, or there's cyclocross teams sort of selling off their old bikes. That if you can sort of connect with, I sarcastically call them black market bicycle deals, but it's definitely a legitimate source for a bike. And yeah, Pros Closet is a good resource as well, but that's most of what Pros Closet sells is sort of used team bikes where they were new a year ago or 6 months ago, but they've been completely rebuilt. All of the parts have been replaced. They're certified by professional mechanics, and you can, they're not cheap, but they're definitely, in my experience, they can be sort of that sweet spot, the best of both worlds, to split the difference between a brand new bike and a used bike. And I think that there's enough people in the Facebook group that we can kind of connect. If people are interested in that, we can certainly connect with resources to, a lot of it is word of mouth and stuff like that. We can connect people. So once you kind of settle on what kind of bike you're going to get, maybe you've made the decisions already about the disc brakes. Another big decision to make is cable versus electronic shifting. And I am not as familiar with sort of what the gravel world is doing these days in terms of, are they using electronic shifting? Are they using cable shifting? Is it mixed bag? But that's definitely, it's a decision that's worth considering. The cabled shifting is something that has been around forever, and if you're like me, you've gotten pretty good at switching out a cable on the fly if you have to. There's no harm in continuing to run that. The electronic shifting is newer, obviously, and as long as you remember to charge your batteries and ride with a spare charged, one, I think, you're good to go. In a lot of cases, um, it can be smoother. You don't necessarily feel that click of something shifting into place, but the electronic shifting is very calibrated and it's very precise. You know, in many cases, I think it would come down to cost. For a new rider getting equipment, they might, if you're looking for a trade-off cost-wise, you're saying, okay, I could either get hydraulic disc brakes or I could get electronic shifting. Personally, I would put the money into the disc brakes, and run cable shifting and upgrade as you go, because that's sort of one of the best things about a bike is that different systems can be upgraded as you go. So you can really grow with your bike in a lot of ways. So I think that the next sort of biggest decision I have on my list here for when you're setting up a new bike, or even assessing your current bike and say, hey, what do I want to change out? What do I want to, maybe upgrade next, is the wheels and tires. So this is, we could probably spend 3 weeks just on this topic alone, right? But I always tell people that in my opinion, in my experience, the most cost-effective way to upgrade an existing bike, to improve your performance on an existing bike, is to get a new wheel set. I know a few years ago, my mom, who still rides probably an early 2000s Le Mans road bike, was signed up for the New York City Triathlon. And she was like, oh, well, all these people that I'm training with are getting these like $10,000 tri bikes. Maybe I should get one of those, but I love my bike so much. And I'm like, Mom, what are you talking about? I'm like, just get new wheels. So we ended up, getting her a very nice wheel set, putting it on her existing bike, and it made all the difference in the world. She's like, I was faster than all those people on their tri bikes. And I'm like, yeah. So that's really the most bang for your buck way, especially if you love the bike you're on, to say, hey, I'm going to just get a new wheel set. And especially riding gravel, if the stock bike that you're on, if you got a stock bike, if you got a used bike, whatever, if whatever bike you're on is, say, clincher tires, which are the traditional, rubber tire with a tube inside that inflates, been around since 1887 or whatever, that is something where you could spend a little bit of money on a tubeless tire system and really see an increase in performance, and a lot less headache, with these pesky little pinch flats or whatever you would encounter on the tubes. So the whole idea of tubeless tires, and Laura and I were talking about this as well, kind of leading up to today, is that I think she said, 99% of the gravel athletes today ride tubeless tire systems. And so the way that this really works, and maybe we can post after this, I'll sketch out, some of the like cross sections of the rims. So the traditional clincher rim has a bead on the tire that actually sits inside of a ridge on the rim. And it just sits there. It doesn't like lock into place. You can use pretty much any wheel with any tire as long as the diameters match up. When you're talking about tubular tires, and this is where I think some of the vocabulary gets a little confusing, is tubeless versus tubular. So a tubular tire is what a lot of pro teams on the road will ride, and it's like a hand sewn, it's a fully cased, like a donut basically, and it's hand sewn and it's actually glued onto the rim. So the rim for a tubular tire doesn't have a little ridge on it. It's sealed off, so there's no spokes poking through, and the tire itself is glued on with a pretty intricate process. Um, and those tires you can run extremely low pressure. So I know, like for the cyclocross team, we will run exclusively tubular tires because we can get down to like 15, 14 psi. Whereas with a clincher tire, where you have to inflate to the point that it seats that bead of the tire in the ridge on the rim, you will have to inflate to a higher pressure to make that seal. So you may have to run 80 psi to get the same seal that you would running 15 psi in a tubular tire. The tubeless tires kind of split the difference between the two. And you know, this is sort of my like disclaimer is, I personally ride clincher tires on all of my bikes, because for me at home they're the easiest to work on repeatedly. I avoid tubeless personally because I have a pretty severe allergy to latex, which is what the sealant is made of. That doesn't mean I don't work on the tubeless tires. It just means I don't ride them myself because of the repeated contact. You know, I've set up tubeless systems, I've worked on them. So we can certainly talk through all of those questions, but unfortunately I don't have like a tubeless tire in front of me to like peel apart and show you guys. But that's one of those, we can post some pictures and maybe some sketches as a follow-up to this kind of conversation. So the tubeless tires actually, I think they came onto the market probably 20 years ago, because it was like a couple of years before I started working for Mavic. That Mavic actually introduced, you know, their UST, like the industry standard tubeless setup, to the market. And the best way that I can think of to describe the tubeless setup is the rim looks just like a clincher rim, right? So there's the ridges, you know, it comes up a little bit on the sides and there's a ridge in there that the tire bead is going to seat into. But the tire is very specifically made to fit with the rim, right? So it's almost like the seal on a Ziploc bag where you can kind of click it into place. And that's going to mean that you can have that seal just by installing the tire and inflating it to a high pressure once, and then you can run a lower pressure, you know, as you continue. Maybe not as low as with a tubular, but you certainly don't have to run a clincher level pressure on that. The benefit of running a lower pressure or running something like that tubeless system is that you're going to be more resistant to flats. If you think about riding over like a class 4 gravel road, or you know, a trail in the woods that has roots and rocks sticking up, if you're running a high pressure, you're going to hit that rock and your tire is going to want to skip off the top of it, right? If you're running a lower pressure, your tire is actually going to deform around the rock, kind of absorb it a little bit and keep rolling, as opposed to hitting it like an obstacle. That's going to eliminate pinch flats. Or with the tubeless system, you actually run, and this one I do have a little bit of show and tell for. You actually run a sealant inside. This is just like I think Stan's, no tubes, but there's a variety of sealants out there. Cafe latex is another good one. But you're running this liquid sealant inside the tire in place of a tube. So if you get a tiny little puncture, or you know, like a thorn or something goes into the tire, the sealant is going to, you know, cover that up and fill the gap, right? So you're not going to have to stop. And with a clincher system, you'd probably get a pinch flat or like a little tiny like snake bite poke in the tube. And then it's like, all right, crap, I got to stop. I got to pull off the wheel. I got to change the flat. Something like that. The sealant will eliminate that. Where the tubeless systems become a little bit more pesky, and this is just a trade-off that you know the kind of riding you're doing, your comfort level with the maintenance stuff, is something more severe like a large puncture or a gash, right? That's something where the tire itself is maybe torn, there's sealant leaking out, something like that. It's you've got a little bit bigger of a problem than just a thorn in there or something. That's something with the tubular system where you're going to have to pull the tire off the rim or partially off the rim, patch that little section, and then add more sealant, and reset that bead onto the rim. On the trail, that takes a bit more time than changing out a tube, but again, it's definitely, with a lot of these tubeless systems, it's worth it for the trade-off of not having the pesky little stuff happen. I know on the Facebook group, there were a lot of questions on how to boot a tire, how to patch a tire that gets one of those gashes or something on the trail, and that's a lot of it is personal preference. So some manufacturers out there for tires make like plug kits that you can like install almost like a rubber plug into the tire, and usually one or two of those will seal up a big gap or a big gash. Another option is trying to just patch it. I've heard of people riding with a couple strips of duct tape, sort of pre-cut and stuck onto like wax paper so that they fit in a seat bag without having to carry a whole roll of duct tape. But that, in an emergency situation like that, you can usually seal that tire. You clean it off, seal it with the duct tape, and you can reinflate, reapply some sealant, and are safe to roll home on that. It's definitely not one of those where I'd say, oh yeah, go out the door tomorrow on the duct tape and you're fine. No, this is like to get you home in the event that something happens on the trail. The other one that I've used myself, and again, this depends on the size of the gash in the tire and whether you're running sealant, is I've actually folded up like a dollar bill and stuck it in the tire, because the weave of the dollar bill paper, whatever material they use for that, is pretty resistant. And so that is another option. If you're going to put sealant in there, I would maybe put like the dollar bill and then some duct tape, just because I'm not sure. I haven't tested how a dollar bill holds up with sealant. The other option, and this is something that seems silly to even think about if you're riding a tubeless system, is to carry a tube with you, because in the absolute worst case scenario, you can put a tube into a tubeless tire and roll home on that. And I've had a couple of situations, where I'm working with like a junior team, and they've got like a spare set of wheels that's tubeless compatible, and I'm like, hey guys, I'm just gonna run this with tubes because I don't, if I'm working on this couple spare sets of wheels every day, I don't want to deal with the sealant. And that's an option too, is to stick a tube in there, roll home on that, and then deal with the repair when you get home. So I think there's questions about the sealant being bad for the environment. So the sealant, to my understanding, the sealant is latex, and latex is natural rubber. So it's probably not. It's not like you're putting a horrible chemical compound out into the environment. Um, you know, but at the same time, I wouldn't go drinking a bottle of it, or leaving a bottle out for, like, my dog to gnaw on. Um, I think most of the time, if you're fixing a flat trail side, you're going to use sort of you're going to use a valve core extractor tool, um, which is probably the easiest way. The valve core in a tubeless tire, um, it seals into the rubber of the tire very much like the washer on a hose that seals the hose to the spigot, right? So you're not going to get any leaks. With this tool, you can, sort of unseat that valve core, pull it out, and you've got a hole right there that you can put the sealant into. So it's fairly no mess in that scenario where you're adding sealant, just fixing, a flat like that trail side. With the I'm like lost my place in my notes here. With
I'll chime in and say something. I've had
Yeah, go for it.
experience where you do get a flat that you have a bunch of sealant and then suddenly you have sealant spraying everywhere.
Yeah,
Uh, the one, like sometimes you can, if you get off your bike, pick up your bike and spin the wheel really hard, you'll get it to coagulate more quickly than you will just like standing. If you stand there, it will probably just keep spewing. Uh,
yeah,
Sometimes getting the wheel back in motion will help it to fill into the puncture and coagulate there.
yeah.
My
I've definitely
opinion.
I've definitely seen that happen for sure. I think like and I've seen it, maybe not in a gravel ride, but in a cross race, right, where somebody's wheel starts just like spewing sealant everywhere. Um, and their first instinct is to slow down, and it's like, no, 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 like speed up or hop off your bike and spin the wheel really fast and try to get that sealant to plug the gap. um, at least to make it a little bit further. So I think in that sense, it's probably, you know obviously the less of it you leak, the better. But as far as exactly how bad it is or how good it is for the environment, I don't have, a good pulse on that data really. But my guess would be that a little bit here and there is okay. Um, as far as sort of the maintenance on a tubeless system, I think that this is definitely important, because it's one of those, if you're getting this for your bike, or if you're investing in this um, as an upgrade on your bike, right? You need to know what you're signing up for. And for me personally, it's like I don't like to ride anything that I can't at least maintain myself at home. And so for sealant, I would always check it about once a month. So a bottle of sealant like this, that's sort of closed up and airtight, can it can last for years, right? It's not going to dry out. It's not going to, I swish it around and I still hear liquid inside, and it's probably 3 years old. Um, Inside of a tire, though, sealant has a lifespan of about 1 to 6 months. And that's depending on how often you ride. It's depending on how hot it is where you're riding. Um, but I would generally say checking it at least once a month is a good practice to get into. You're going to want to peel off, half of the bead of the tire, and just check that the sealant in there is still liquid. If it's drying out, or sometimes it like forms these nasty looking like little boogers in there, it's definitely time to just take like a rag, or I've even used a Clorox wipe before, and just wipe out that tire, clean out the sealant, put fresh sealant in, and then reseal that tire. if it's dry or gooey, that's sort of the rule of thumb there. Sometimes you can actually pick up the wheel, and I've noticed this more with like mountain bike wheels. You can pick up the wheel and spin it, and sometimes you can hear the liquid like sloshing around in there, and that's, you don't even need to pull the bead in that case. You can just be like, all right, I hear liquid moving around, we're good to go. So that's definitely, and that's kind of it as far as the maintenance on those go. um, I think if it's something like, if you're not already riding um, a tubeless system and you're looking at investing in that, it's something that I would even say, maybe we can post something like this is sort of the cheater vocabulary list on this, um, because there's so many options out there right now in the market for different systems. So some companies will say, "Oh, this is tubeless ready," and it's like, that to me is like, okay, so you're setting it up with clinchers now, but you mean that you can change it over to tubeless, but tubeless ready in sort of the marketing speak of the bike industry means that those wheels are indicated for tubeless tires. Um, a lot of tubeless ready wheels will have a corresponding set of or options of tubeless tires that they recommend to work with, because of that like almost Ziploc bag type seal between the two. Um, Tubeless compatible wheels, if you're getting a new bike, and you want to have the option for tubeless later on but not be 100% committed right now, tubeless compatible wheels are the way to go. Um, they the spoke beds, right? So when you pull the tire off, sometimes you can see the screws holding the spokes underneath the rim, and sometimes you can't, right? So um, in a lot of clincher wheels, right, you'll pull off the tire, you'll see like this almost rubber band going around, that covers those spokes so that the tube doesn't puncture on the spoke. In a tubeless system, or a tubular system for that matter, those spokes are completely sealed off from what you actually see when you pull that tire off. Uh, in a tubeless compatible system, they're not necessarily sealed off on their own, as manufactured. You retrofit them with tubeless tape, which kind of acts as a seal in that rim bed. But the tubeless compatible rims will have that ridge in them, like they have that like half a Ziploc feature, right, where you can get tires that will lock and key in, um, and not just hook in with pressure. Um, the other sort of option out there is a set of Mavic wheels, and those are usually marketed as like UST, which is their original, like the first tubeless technology to make it into the industry. Um, those are sort of, they sell the wheels and the tires together. That's just a Mavic thing, where they'll say this wheel goes with this tire. Buy them together. There are, that's great because it's an absolutely perfect fit. You don't have to like check that your rim is going to fit with your tire bead. But in that sense, it might feel a little bit limiting, like you have to get the tire that's indicated for that rim. It's getting better lately with third party manufacturers who are making UST compatible tires. But that's something that I would sort of consult your shop on, to say like, hey, I'm thinking of investing in a tubeless system, or I want to make that shift to tubeless. How do I know that, like, or what tires would you recommend for this exact set of wheels? assuming that you probably have the wheels before you get the tires, sort of thing. Um, and again, this is one of those where the initial setup of the tubeless system I would have done at a shop, especially if it's your first time. But the maintenance you can do at home for sure. And and Laura and I were talking about this before, I think Roxy as well a little bit. It's depending on your budget, depending on your comfort level with this stuff, it's a lot easier to maintain a tubeless system or set one up if you have an air compressor. Just because that initial like jolt of pressure is what you need to seat that, like to seal that Ziploc bag on the rim, if that makes sense. You know, for me, I've been able to do it with like the handheld Craftsman inflator that they don't make anymore, unfortunately. But I think uh, you can get a air compressor at Home Depot for under $100 most of the time. The only sort of caution I would have there is that you're going to have to get most of the air compressors you would get at Home Depot come with a Schrader valve on them, like for a car. You're going to have to adapt that to Presta. So that would be one thing that I would definitely plan for, is to either have one of those little screw-in adapters or have like a hose clamp that you can cut off the Schrader valve that's installed on the air compressor and replace it with a Presta valve. And I'm like checking the comments here too. Yes, so if you're installing your own, there's sort of a couple of comments here about the tubeless tape. It's a multi-day process to set up a new tubeless system, and that's one of those, you know, if you're doing it at home and you have the patience for that, go for it. I definitely wouldn't recommend doing it yourself the first time, because you're not sure what you should be looking for. But once you're more comfortable with it, go for it. A shop would do the same thing, where they would set it aside as a multi-day process. So you'd have you would first make sure that rim bed, the spokes are sealed off. So that's where, if you have to apply the tubeless tape, you need some time for that to cure, basically. So you'd apply that, let them sit, and then you would need, you know, time to seat the tires, and then ensure that the sealant is covered, and then go back and recheck the sealant and sort of let it sit in between each of those steps. So it is a bit of a process for sure. Other questions on tubeless tires maintenance? How to select them? I'm trying to be conscious of time here too. I feel like I blinked and it's almost an hour. So
There's a lot of good information, so thank you. Yeah,
oh
really fast.
yeah.
Well, we don't have any other questions. I know Sarah can be. Are you on the Facebook group? I know I've tagged you before.
I'm on the Facebook group. I tend to like ignore Facebook most of the time, but I definitely will post some stuff in there too, as a follow up. You know, some sketches of the different rim profiles and how to select some stuff for sure.
That would be awesome. Well, we sure appreciate all your time. Thank you so
Yeah.
much
Oh,
for
thank you guys for kind of
meeting us.
having me and putting all this together.
I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.
Yeah.
Talk to you next week.
Sounds good.